Howdy, y'all. Welcome to Galactic Collaboration Summit 2020. In this session, we'll be looking at a beginner's guide to creating custom connectors for PowerApps and PowerAutomate. My name is Eric Shupps, Office Servers and Services MVP. If you'd like to reach out and connect with me after the session, you can do so on Twitter at eShupps, Facebook, SlideShare to get copies of the slides, LinkedIn, and there will be samples of the code that we'll be looking at in the session posted to my GitHub repo at github.com/eShupps. We're going to keep this one pretty simple. It's a beginner's guide starting basically from zero, assuming no prior knowledge of custom connectors in PowerApps or Flow, which we'll refer to collectively as the Power Platform, but we'll look at examples of using them in both. So we'll do a little bit of background, talking about how these are configured and the things you need to know to build them. And then we'll jump straight into a demo of building them from scratch, and we'll look at a pre-configured connector with sample hub that's posted, or sample code posted up to GitHub so you can review it after you've gone through the session, work through it at your own pace. So let's start with a little bit of background. First off, why do we need custom connectors in Power Platform when there are so many connectors available out of the box? Not only are there quite a few available natively to the platform, but you also have quite a large number of them from premium sources. Now, that may or may not solve the challenge that you're looking for. There may be a connector that almost does what you need, or it does half of what you need and you need to augment it with additional functionality. It may be that your user base is not sophisticated enough to create their own expressions and syntax, or the expressions and syntax are confusing, or there are just too many ways of doing the same thing. And whenever we set up those barriers for users, the harder we make it, the less and less they're going to adopt the platform. So if we expect them to know custom expression syntax from the outset, that could be a barrier to adoption. If we can provide them a custom connector that makes it drag and drop easy for them to build their flows and their apps, we can rapidly increase adoption in the organization. So it may just simply be a matter of supplanting something that's really already there out of the box. You're just making it easier for your users to implement that. Or you may be in a situation where you have back-end systems or potentially private cloud systems that you need to connect to. There's not a public connector available. The Microsoft connectors don't get you the specific functionality that you need from your system, or for third-party integrations, or for other systems that you need to integrate with. So you need a custom connector to build that. Finally, let's not forget the cost. Premium connectors aren't free, so there is definitely a cost associated with implementing those, and depending on the amount of usage in your flows and your apps, that could be a very considerable cost in your organization. So that's definitely something to consider. Let's take a really basic example, though, of a use case where we can make things easier for a user with a custom connector without expecting them to learn syntax. Remember, to us developers, syntax is different from code, but to the average user, it's the same thing. So if we look at the sad dog here on the slide, we'll see that what they're trying to do is implement a relatively basic, to us developers, basic function of getting the day of the week out of a date time value, in this case, the start time of flow, and getting it into a local time zone rather than UTC. Well, we have a couple of problems here for your average user. First of all, they're going to attempt maybe a format date as their first expression attempt. They're going to have to go and look up the date time format syntax for .NET to understand how to format that from a date time to a string and find the right value that they're looking for. And then secondarily, they're not going to understand that things come through in UTC. So they'll run it through first. They'll realize their times are wrong. They'll have to go out and figure out what's happening here. Oh, it's pulling back in universal coordinated time. I need to convert this, find an expression that'll bring that down to my local time. Then I have to figure out exactly what or what region value it's looking for. In this case, the very explicit syntax of Eastern Standard Time. Get that wrong, and the convert time function won't return to you the right value. So although this looks relatively simple, for your average power user, understanding exactly how to implement this function, making sure that they're using single quotes in the right places rather than double quotes, because if you enclose double quotes around that formatting value, it's not going to work. How do you do a trigger body action and then with the start? This is a lot more complex than it may appear. Whereas with the happy dog on the right-hand side, we've made it very easy for our user to implement this function. They pull a dynamic value for the timestamp. They set their source time zone, which would be UTC and GMT are the same effective time, unless, for example, that you're using British time and it's in the summer months where you may want to use BST instead of GMT. But you can select that from a selector without having to know the specific time values, and then pick the target time zone that you want to convert it to and put in your format. So this is very much more drag and drop, a little bit of knowledge required. You need to know what the format string is, and you need to understand that UTC and GMT are basically the same time. There's nothing really in the flow that tells you, oh, if you're using the timestamp, this is going to come through to UTC. So a little bit of knowledge, but much easier for the user to implement as part of a custom action, and you could potentially name it differently into something that the user would understand a little bit better. So that's a basic use case for building a custom connector. Obviously, most of the payoff for these would be more complex backend systems, third-party APIs that you have to connect to. The users just won't know how to implement that functionality. The overall framework is actually pretty simple. Everything is driven off an API structure that's defined as a set of actions and descriptors. So it starts with building an action framework that will allow users to identify something within their Flow or Power App and then drag and drop it onto the canvas. Although, point of contention there, Power Apps are a bit less user-friendly in terms of drag and drop functionality than Flows, where they have to know the name of the connector and use the dot syntax to figure out what action. However, once you have them in place, it's relatively easy for users to figure out what to do. The description defines those components, giving them helps and tips and hints inside of their flows to see what valuables to put where and how they should be formatted. Those are the visual elements of the connector to the user. But behind the scenes is where all the work happens. You have a Swagger definition, an open API specification definition that determines how the overall connector is put together, and then the target API that it's connecting to. Within that set of components, we have 5 very distinct areas. We start with the basic overall information. We have our actions. This defines what the connector does. We have the triggers that interact with the system. For example, a timed trigger or a webhook driven polling type of trigger for automated interaction. There's also some advanced scenarios around collapsing your definitions into more usable components using references, not something that can be done in the UI, and policies which allow you to facilitate dynamic runtime components. So let's just talk about these quickly individually so they make more sense when we jump into the UI. General information about the connector is actually very simple. You have a title and version and description. Obviously, those are pretty straightforward. You'll want to give them things that when users are looking through the long list of information available to them in the UI, when they're selecting from their list of available actions in Flow or PowerApps, that they can get to yours very easily and understand what it does. Then you define things like the host, that's your target system for your API, the scheme, HTTP or HTTPS, the base path that you'll be querying. For example, in most implementation these days, that's /API, and a security definition. There are 4 different types. We'll see those in the UI, from no security whatsoever, basic API key, and OAuth. And these can be defined in the wizard that you use when creating the connector, or you can build them all as part of your Swagger definition, as you can see there on the slide. The actions is the meat. This is where things are really happening inside of your connector. This defines the API endpoints. What are you connecting to? What actions are you performing? And what HTTP verb are you using to perform those actions. Are you simply getting information using a get? Are you supplying information with, say, a post, put, or patch, deleting, and also specifying if there's any headers that go along or other options that get transmitted? So you can get fairly complex with how this definition is constructed, understanding that multiple methods can be supported in a single base path. So when you define your path, for example, /API, these are all going to be relative, by the way, which isn't immediately visible in the UI, but when you define your paths, they should all be relative to your host, your path, and then the individual actions themselves. Each one needs to have an identifier that's unique within the scope of the Swagger file, so they won't be named the same thing. And depending on how you're implementing them, if you intend to do more of these in PowerApps than Flow, for example, you need to be really careful with how you supply those definitions so it makes a lot of sense to the user. You can also use tags to group these together, a bit of an advanced Swagger topic, not always supported or implemented well within the target systems, but they help to group your operations together into things like, say, string manipulation or date time or text or whatever you're doing for your specific set of APIs. Now, triggers are a more advanced topic. We won't actually look at those in the demo, but they give you two mechanisms to automate interaction with the target system in Power Platform. So you can have a polling model, which is a poll where it queries your API for data set on a schedule that you've defined. You can also have a webhook model where you push from your system into a flow to trigger something happening when API events are occurring. A few things that you need to know when creating those. There's some links at the end of this the end of this slide deck with documentation where you can understand how to build these and all the ins and outs of building them. There's a few specific things that you need to know when you're building and publish things to get them to work properly. References are something that you're going to use to actually make your documentation of the connector easier. They don't improve or add any specific value. Let's say you have 10 actions that all return a basic string response. Well, within the definition, the way that the Swagger file is constructed, you would put those response objects into each one of your actions. If they're all the same, though, that's a lot of extraneous coding in JSON or YAML to pull that all together or redoing things in the UI. Instead, you can use references so that you can define a response, like you see I have here, basic string, that identifies the properties of the object, and then you can reuse them within your Swagger file. We'll look at that when we dig down into the actual Swagger itself. Policies are really handy for doing runtime manipulation of information. If, for example, you may need to change the host URL that you're pointing to for your endpoint API, the user can do that when they're building their flow or app if you have created a policy that allows you to dynamically map a variable. You can also set your query string parameters for an operation dynamically using dynamic values. And there's a whole host of available options here, converting object types from one to another. Let's say you have a date time, you need to convert it to a string. Well, instead of doing that in a separate action, you can do that directly within the policy itself. So it makes it not quite so static in your API definition, a little bit more dynamic for the user to implement. And these can all be defined specifically within the UI when creating your connector. Your API is completely up to you. Doesn't matter what language it's in, doesn't matter what system it runs on. It just needs to be a publicly accessible RESTful service. Something like Azure Functions works really well, but it can be any platform that you choose that works for you, as long as it's a RESTful endpoint. You can map your routes and security methods within your Swagger definition. If you want to get a little more advanced on the Azure stack, you can use Azure API management to do things like extract your URLs and provide your authentication and authorization mechanisms for you. But at the end of the day, really what's happening in your API is that you're processing inputs, you're returning outputs. So here we see a quick example of an Azure function taking a string and doing some manipulation on that string. But this can be any system that you're targeting and any set of activities that takes place within the API itself. A few things to know before you dig in and start creating your own definitions. First of all, it really helps to be familiar with the Swagger syntax. This is Open API Specification version 2.0. There's a 3.0 version that is the newer Open API spec. Generally, when we say Swagger, we're talking about Open API 2.0. You can go and look up the differences between 2.0 and 3.0. It's the Swagger API 2.0 version of Open API that's supported by Power Platform. Understanding how those files are constructed can really assist you in building better building better definitions and making it easier for your user, adding things like examples and using the XMS summary and definition tags to improve that user experience. There's also a few things that aren't available in the UI, such as the ref tags. It's there, but there's no way to edit it, as we'll see. Triggers are pretty advanced. When you're just getting started, I would probably advise of staying away from these until you get a little bit more familiar with how everything's working, then going back and adding triggers to your definition. They're pretty hard to debug. It takes a lot of back and forth playing with the system to get them right. First time doing this, understand that CORS is probably going to impact your API accessibility, especially when you're doing testing from Flow. Make sure that you have the CORS flags properly set on your application. If you're doing that in Azure API or in Azure Functions, you can do that on the function, or in Azure API Management, you can do that on the product or on the APIs themselves. Policies, very helpful. Wouldn't probably use them straight out of the gate. Just learning these probably would be one of the first things I come back in and add to my API add to my definition after I've become a little bit more familiar. Authentication, of course, is always hard. You can start with no auth whatsoever. A lot of APIs use an API key, which is a very straightforward mechanism for implementing. That's what we're going to look at in our example. OAuth is a pretty advanced topic. Again, probably would stay away from that one until you get a little bit more advanced. So what we're going to do is look at creating a custom connector, and then we'll flip over and do a Julia Childs and pull one out of the oven that's already been created. That'll be our sample code for you that's in the GitHub repo that you can go through at your leisure. But let's walk through it in the UI and see how these are built. So in our flow dashboard, if we go to our flows, it'll come up with a list of our flows, and we could go down to data and look at our custom connectors. Bit of a strange place to put it under data if you're not familiar with, but this is where you would go to build out your custom connectors. Now you can see here I've got a few that I've already built. We'll go ahead and create a new one from blank, just so we can look through the options that are available in the UI. So this uses a wizard type of interface to walk you through the process, starting with general information, moving on to the security aspect, the definition, and then there's a testable components. You can actually test your APIs from working within the UI as you're building your connector. Great for simple connectors that you're just building to test things out, sort of quick, rapid prototyping mechanism. If you're doing really advanced testing, you might want to use Postman or Swagger.io or something else to do that. Testing gives you a little bit more of a control. Here you can supply a icon and a background color for your custom connector. Sounds a bit simplistic, but really there's so many that when you start searching through, when users go in and just start searching for a particular activity, these icons really help them differentiate. So if you have a company branded icon that you're using here, it helps them to drill down and see, oh, this is one of our internal ones that we use all of the time. The interface can get a little cluttered when looking through the list of available actions. You can give it a description here. So we'll give ours a color and a little bit of a description. Now, if you're using an on-premises gateway, you can check that here. There's some configuration that needs to be done for that, hence the helpful learn more tag. Pick your scheme and then give it a host. So here we have api.contoso.com. A host and a base URL. If you are using the standard base pathing for most RESTful APIs here, you would use /API, but this could be anything that you want for your custom application. There's no strict requirement there. Now, moving on to the security aspect, here you can see the 4 basic types. None, this would just be an anonymous HTTP operation to your endpoint. You can go with basic auth and supply a username and password. Here's where it can be helpful, obviously, to use a policy to set these things dynamically. You can use an API key, giving it a parameter label and where it goes, whether it's in the query itself or in the header. Let's just switch back to none for the moment so we can step through into our definition. Now, here in the definition, we're defining our 4 major categories: our actions, triggers, references, and policies. Note we have the capability to add new ones in each section except references. This just simply isn't available in the UI. You can do it directly in your Swagger file. Let's create a new action. We'll give it a test action with a description. This is a test action. And an operation ID, something like test action. Note it starts filling these out for you automatically here so that this is unique. There's also an XMS visibility tag where you can set here the visibility of the information that you're displaying in the action. So whether they have to go to the advanced tab to see it or whether it's something marked internal, etc. You can then set up your request and response information and some validation here in the operation ID, and you'll see that it's going through and looking and validating these as we start to fill this out. So here's an example. I could do a get to, now this URL here, this is where it gets a little confusing because in the UI, it's showing a fully qualified URL. That's not actually what you'll do here. It would be this, which would be a relative URL. Here you can define any headers. We can do a quick import and see how it automatically builds that API for us properly using the information that we supplied on the first step of the wizard. Now, if you need to add some path information, you can go back to your sample, say I want to do test operation ID equal something like that. I can then import that and you'll see that it starts to build out the query values here. I can edit that and start to add my own types of queries, what format they're in and type, etc. And go through and build these, give it a description, right? Summary and default values for my parameters. These help the user, guide the user through what needs to be supplied. So if a default value was blue, they would know, oh, I'm not supposed to enter a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I've defined that particular query. If there are headers, I can add that as well. And if we're going to a post operation, for example, let's add a post. And again, let's say this is test operation. I can have a body. It gives you a helpful example here where I could say something like ID, like so, import, and now I have a body. And we've defined the type, obviously, for our schema property ID, setting the string, integer, number, Boolean, what have you. These are basic primitive JSON types that you'll be implementing. And also whether there's a drop-down type that you can pick when the user is putting these pieces together and building out the parameters for your operation. All right, so let's step back. All right, we'll see that it's switched it from in the query over here to the body. We can add a default response. What does this look like? This is where we would say, oh, it's a basic string. So I could say something like value, and that would be my return. Now I have a basic default response, and it validates whether or not this matches or conforms to its expectation. Now, there's no requirement that this starts with an uppercase letter. This is just a validation step that it puts in because that's how it's going to show up in the connection information, especially in PowerApps where you have to do this from a syntax basis. Now, if you want to add triggers or policies, you can do those here in the UI. If we look quickly over at our test, sorry, I would have to create. That's going to save. Once it saves, then it will allow us to perform the test operations. Now let's switch over from that and let's look at one that is a little bit more built out. Let's jump into our sample code here. And let's go to the Swagger editor and look at how we have this built out. So this is showing a YAML definition of our operation. Actually, it did not update, and it's showing our test one that we built out. So let's go back to our custom connectors. This is a bug in the UI. Let's see if we can get that to refresh. And load up the connector that we actually want. Now in the Swagger editor, you have complete control over your definition. And you can add things that aren't available in the UI, like ref tags, for example. Here we go. This looks a little bit better. So here we have a more built out scenario. You can see from in the Swagger definition how we have the title, the schemes. Here's our action, which converts currency from one currency to another. Our descriptions. Here's our parameters. Now notice in my schema for my parameter, I'm using this ref called a currency conversion, and also in my responses. So I have a basic number and a basic string response here. Those are defined down in my definitions section. Here's my currency conversion and my string responses. So these make it easier to use on multiple scenarios, and I can also do a test. You can authorize them here by supplying your API key or whatever it is that you're using, and you can test it directly from within the application. So I can come here and I can do a quick test. You can do a tryout and submit the information. You don't have to do it here. You can also do it from any given Swagger editor. So I'm over in Swagger.io. I could do the same thing by giving it a quick test, supplying some basic information and getting some kind of response. So we'll do an execute, and here you can see what it's executed. And in this case, I don't have it defined correctly for this test, so it's giving me a 404 that it can't find that particular endpoint. But you can do the same thing from here. You'll note that it uses the same type of visual construct. So here we have a complete Swagger file defining our action and all of its operations, but how does that look to the end user? Well, if we come into our flows, we have a basic one here that uses our connectors. So let's switch back. Here it is. And if we edit our flow, we can see our connector action available in the canvas. This allows the user to find it, drag and drop it. So if we go to a new step and we go to custom connectors, we can see here in the custom connectors that it's available to us. Here is our conversion utility, and it shows you what actions are available within that particular connector. So you can see it here is the convert currency. When we edit it, we can see it's looking for our three source inputs, our value, source currency, and target currency. Notice the drop-down selectors make it easy for the user to pick those values, not have to know what those specific abbreviations are. We can then format that number that we get back here as our output, as our value, give it a format and send it in an email to the users. When we kick that off, we get a nice, simple response. Much easier than trying to do some complex expression syntax for the end user. You can have multiple of these in different categories that they pick from. Note again, when we do a search, by default, they come to here. So if you're looking for currency, it's going to do a search of all the available connectors, including the custom connectors, and show up on the list. Well, you can see our custom one isn't quite showing up here. Over in PowerApps, it's not quite as simple in PowerApps. If we look in our Power app, the syntax, it's a little bit different here where we have to use a dotted notation for the syntax when we interact with, oh, whoops, well, it looks like it wants to default back to trial status. But in Power Apps, we use the dotted notation syntax to access, here it is, our connector where we can do a test conversion, say from US to Canadian, and we can run our connector here and it will go out and execute our operation. So the same basic premise, and in fact, the exact same connector looks the same in the gallery. It's just in Power Apps, you use a bit of syntax to get there as opposed to the drag and drop. So that's a quick introduction to building custom connectors. There's a lot of information there and quite a few things that you need to know to build those out successfully. I have a complete walkthrough over at the Collab Magazine site. Here's the link. You can go and read through the step-by-step of building your own test connector. And you can also get the GitHub repo here at the Conversionator, pull that code down. The Swagger file is included there as well, so you can see what the API does, which is a very basic Azure API implementation. And you can also go through the documentation with the overview and walkthroughs for building the custom connectors for the Power Platform, learn a little bit more about OpenAPI, the parameters and things that you'll be using to expose to the user inside of their connectors, and finally, the more advanced topics of building things like policy templates and triggers. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining us at the Global Collaboration Summit. We certainly hope to see you at the European Collaboration Summit coming this fall in Wiesbaden, Germany. Cowboy out.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.